Yeah, that old deed is worthless. You're already bankrupt.
Read the fine print before you laugh.
Wait, she owns the entire aquifer beneath the project.
No, that's impossible. You tried to buy it for 500.
That's garbage, Maggie, Roderick sneered, his cruel laugh echoing through the suddenly dead-silent mahogany lobby. He pointed mockingly at the yellowed piece of paper trembling in the young woman's hand, completely oblivious that the fragile 1,968 document was about to destroy his life. The town of Oakmont, Pennsylvania, had a way of remembering everything you wanted to forget, and forgetting everything you wanted to be remembered for. For Margaret Maggie Sullivan, driving back over the rusted iron bridge that marked the town limits felt less like a homecoming and more like surrendering to an enemy. It had been 16 years since Maggie packed her life into a dented Honda Civic and fled the suffocating whispers of Oakmont. She had left behind a crumbling Victorian house with a sagging porch and a father who loved the bottom of a bourbon bottle and wild, paranoid theories far more than he loved his only daughter. William Sullivan was the town eccentric, a man who had squandered a modest family inheritance on legal fees, surveying equipment, and barren plots of land on the edge of the county. The town called him Crazy Bill. They called Maggie the Stray. Now, William was dead at 68, his heart finally giving out on the porch of that same rotting house. He left Maggie with exactly 3 things: a mountain of property tax debt, a foreclosure notice pinned to the front door, and a single brass key to a safe deposit box at First Fidelity Bank. Maggie pulled up to the curb outside her childhood home. The grass was waist-high, choked with weeds and thistles. The paint peeled off the siding like dead skin. As she stepped out into the humid July air, the screen door across the street creaked open. Beatrice Gable, the neighborhood's self-appointed watchman, stood on her porch, her eyes narrowed in judgment. "Well, if it isn't the runaway," Beatrice called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Sorry about your daddy, Margaret. Though Lord knows, peace is probably better for a man whose mind was so far gone." "Hello, Mrs. Gable," Maggie replied flatly, refusing to give the old woman the satisfaction of a reaction. "The bank's taking it, you know," Beatrice added, pointing a bony finger at the Sullivan house. "Roderick Pendleton was by just yesterday with the appraisers. Says they're going to level the whole block for the new commercial park. It's for the best. This eyesore has brought down our property values for a decade." Maggie's grip tightened on her car keys. Roderick Pendleton. The name alone left a metallic, bitter taste in her mouth. The Pendletons were Oakmont royalty. Roderick's father, Richard Pendleton, had essentially bought the town during the industrial decline of the 90s, acquiring land for pennies on the dollar. Roderick had inherited his father's wealth, his ruthless business acumen, and his arrogant, razor-thin smile. He had also been Maggie's high school tormentor, the golden boy quarterback who made it his mission to ensure the town drunk's daughter knew exactly where she stood in the social hierarchy. Maggie walked up the creaking steps of her father's house and unlocked the door. The interior smelled of stale tobacco, old paper, and decay. The living room was a labyrinth of stacked cardboard boxes, blueprints, and yellowed legal pads. Her father had spent the last 20 years obsessed with a tract of land known as the Miller Quarry, a massive, dried-up limestone pit on the North Ridge. He had lost his savings, his reputation, and his mind defending it against the Pendletons. Sitting on the dusty kitchen table was a single envelope with Maggie's name on it, scrawled in her father's shaky handwriting. Inside was the brass key and a note written on the back of a grocery receipt. "Maggie, I'm sorry I wasn't a father. I was a guardian. They're going to tell you I was crazy. They're going to tell you we have nothing. Don't believe them. Go to the bank. Read the fine print. Make them pay." Maggie stared at the note. It was the same paranoid delusion he had spun her entire childhood. Make them pay. With what? A key to an empty box? She was 34, recently laid off from a mid-level marketing job in Chicago, and drowning in credit card debt. She didn't have the energy for her father's ghosts. She just needed to sign the foreclosure papers, maybe find a few $100s in the deposit box to cover the gas back to Illinois, and wash her hands of Oakmont forever. But as she traced the jagged edge of the brass key with her thumb, a quiet, desperate flicker of hope ignited in her chest. What if? First Fidelity of Oakmont was a monument to old money. Its floors were polished Italian marble, and its tellers operated behind thick mahogany partitions with brass grills. It was designed to make you feel small, and as Maggie walked through the revolving glass doors in her faded jeans and worn leather jacket, she felt microscopic. She approached the front desk. "I'm here to access safe deposit box 402, William Sullivan's account. I'm his daughter." The teller's eyes flicked over her, recognizing the name instantly. A subtle tightening of the lips, the Oakmont grimace. "I will need to see the death certificate, your identification, and the executor paperwork, Miss Sullivan. And I should inform you, Mr. Pendleton has placed a hold on the estate's physical assets pending the foreclosure settlement." A safe deposit box isn't a physical asset tied to a home mortgage, Maggie said, her voice surprisingly steady. I have the legal right to open it. There seems to be a problem here, Brenda. A smooth, baritone voice echoed from the mezzanine stairs. Maggie turned. Descending the stairs in a bespoke navy suit that cost more than Maggie's car was Roderick Pendleton. He had aged exactly as one would expect. The arrogant boy had simply hardened into a predatory man. His hair was perfectly styled, his smile practiced and hollow. Maggie Sullivan, Roderick said, spreading his arms as if welcoming an old friend, though his eyes were completely dead. My condolences about Bill. Tragic, really. The man fought demons his whole life. I suppose he finally lost. Cut the act, Roderick, Maggie said. I'm here to empty my father's box. Sign your damn foreclosure papers and leave. Roderick chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. Of course. Let's not draw this out. Brenda, take Miss Sullivan to the vault. Let her collect whatever trinkets Bill hoarded away. Then bring her to my office to sign the deed over. Maggie followed the teller into the sterile, steel-lined belly of the bank. The heavy vault door clanked shut behind them. Brenda used the master key, and Maggie inserted her father's brass key into box 402. With a heavy click, the metal drawer slid out. It was astonishingly light. Maggie pulled it completely out and set it on the viewing table. Inside, there was no cash, no gold, no life insurance policy. There was only a tarnished tin cigar box. Maggie opened it. Resting on a bed of velvet was a single, folded piece of legal parchment. It was yellowed at the edges, stiff with age, and stamped with the faded blue seal of the Pennsylvania Land Management Bureau. At the top, bold black letters read, Deed of Conveyance, the 14th of October, 1968. Maggie scanned the document. It was a deed of ownership for the Miller Quarry, a completely barren, 40-acre crater of rock and weeds on the edge of the county. Her father had bought it 50 years ago for next to nothing. The quarry had been stripped of limestone by the 1950s and was universally considered the most useless piece of real estate in the tri-state area. Her stomach plummeted. This was the grand legacy, a piece of paper proving her father owned a giant hole in the ground. She felt a hot flush of humiliation. Her father really was crazy. He had held onto a worthless rock pit while his daughter wore secondhand clothes and his house rotted around him. Clutching the paper, Maggie walked back out into the main lobby. Roderick was leaning against a marble pillar, holding a cup of coffee, chatting with Mayor Richard Collins and Deputy Higgins. They all turned to look at her as she emerged. Find the family fortune, Maggie? Roderick asked loudly, ensuring the entire lobby, currently occupied by about 20 local patrons, could hear. Maggie gripped the deed, her face burning. Just paperwork. Roderick stepped forward and brazenly plucked the folded parchment from her fingers before she could react. He opened it, adjusting his cuffs as he read the heading. For a moment, the lobby was silent. Then, Roderick let out a laugh. It started as a chuckle and erupted into a booming, breathless roar of genuine amusement. It bounced off the marble walls, drawing stares from every teller and customer in the room. A deed? Roderick gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. A 1,968 deed to the Miller Quarry? This is it? This is what Crazy Bill was hiding? Mayor Collins snickered. Deputy Higgins shook his head in pity. Give it back, Roderick, Maggie said, her voice shaking with rage. Maggie, 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 Roderick said, waving the paper like a white flag of surrender. The quarry is a dead zone. The county condemned the access roads a decade ago. You couldn't grow a weed on that land, let alone sell it. Your father died clutching a piece of paper that proves he owned dirt. The townspeople in the lobby were openly whispering now. The outcast had returned, and the joke was just as pathetic as they had always expected. Roderick stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone of mocking sympathy. Tell you what, I feel bad for you. I really do. The bank is taking your house by Friday. You have nothing. I will give you $500 out of my own pocket, right now, for this piece of trash, just to save you the trouble of using it as kindling. Maggie looked at the smirking faces around her. She looked at the paper in Roderick's hand. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Read the fine print. She snatched the deed back, folding it carefully and sliding it into her jacket pocket. I'll keep it, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. Roderick's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. Suit yourself, Maggie. You're just as delusional as he was. You have 3 days to vacate the property before the sheriff forcibly removes you. Maggie turned on her heel and walked out of the bank. The heavy glass doors shut behind her, cutting off the whispers, but the burning in her chest remained. She marched to her car, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unlock the door. She sat in the driver's seat, pulled the deed out, and stared at it. It was just a standard land deed. Boundaries, coordinates, legal jargon, but then her eyes drifted to the bottom of the second page. There was a secondary stamp, almost completely faded, accompanied by a typed addendum signed by a federal surveyor. Addendum C, mineral, subterranean, and watershed sovereignty. Maggie didn't know what it meant, but she knew someone who would. The Oakmont County Records Office was located in the basement of the municipal courthouse, a windowless dungeon of filing cabinets and the smell of decomposing paper. It was the undisputed kingdom of Thomas Abernathy, a 72-year-old archivist who had worked for the county since the Nixon administration. Thomas was a solitary man with thick Coke bottle glasses and a mind like a steel trap. He had also been the only man in town who would sit and play chess with William Sullivan without treating him like a leper. Maggie found Thomas sitting behind a fortress of stacked leather-bound ledgers, eating a lukewarm tuna sandwich. "Mr. Abernathy?" The old man looked up, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He squinted at her for a long moment before his face broke into a gentle, melancholy smile. "Little Maggie Sullivan, I heard you were back in town. I was sorry to hear about your dad. He was a difficult man, but he wasn't a bad one." "Thank you, Thomas," Maggie said, pulling up a creaky metal folding chair. "I need your help. I need you to look at something." She pulled the deed from her jacket and laid it flat on the desk, smoothing out the deep creases. Thomas wiped his hands on a napkin and pulled a magnifying loupe from his breast pocket. He leaned over the document. "Ah, the Miller Quarry, 1,968. I remember when Bill bought this. The whole town thought he'd lost his marbles. Roderick Pendleton laughed in my face today," Maggie said bitterly. "He offered me $500 for it." Thomas's hand suddenly froze. He looked up, his magnified eyes enormous behind the glass. "Roderick offered to buy it? Today?" "Yes, why?" Thomas didn't answer. He stood up with a surprising quickness, grabbed a ring of keys, and walked to a heavy steel cage in the back of the room. He unlocked it and pulled out a massive, dust-covered binder labeled Geological Surveys, 1960 to 1975. He hauled it back to the desk, flipping through the heavy, brittle pages until he found a fold-out map of Oakmont County. "Maggie," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you know what's happening on the east side of town? Roderick's building some commercial park. That's why he's foreclosing on my house. He needs the space." No, Thomas muttered, tracing a finger along the map. "That's the cover story. The commercial park is just a staging area, a smokescreen." He tapped a large red circle on the map. "Last year, Roderick Pendleton quietly brokered a deal to sell 2,000 acres of county land to a subsidiary of Apex Dynamics. You know who they are? The tech giant? They make servers, cloud data centers." "Exactly," Thomas said. "They are building a massive, state-of-the-art hyperscale data center right here in Oakmont. It's a $40 million land deal for the Pendleton Group, and it will bring billions in infrastructure to the county." Maggie frowned. "Okay, but what does that have to do with my dad's rock quarry?" Thomas tapped the map again, then pointed to the faded addendum on her deed. "Data centers generate heat, Maggie. Massive, unimaginable amounts of heat. They require millions of gallons of water a day for their cooling systems. The town's current municipal water grid can't support even a fraction of that." Thomas traced a blue line on the map that ran directly beneath the town. In 1968, the federal government did a geological survey. They found a subterranean aquifer, a massive, naturally replenishing underground lake. It's the only water source in 100 miles capable of sustaining the Apex Dynamics facility. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the blue line. It led directly to a circle, marked Miller Tract. "The aquifer," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "sits almost entirely beneath the Miller Quarry. And in 1968, the laws were different. When your father bought the surface land, the state was desperate to offload it, so they included an ironclad, irrevocable sovereignty clause over all subsurface water and mineral rights." Maggie stared at the old man, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying," Thomas interrupted, tapping the yellowed deed, "that Roderick Pendleton can build all the buildings he wants. But without the water from this specific aquifer, the Apex Dynamics deal is completely dead. And according to this document, you own the exclusive rights to every single drop of that water." The silence in the basement was deafening. The realization washed over Maggie in a tidal wave of adrenaline. Her father wasn't crazy. He hadn't been clinging to a worthless pit of dirt. He had been sitting on the linchpin of a billion-dollar corporate empire, waiting for the exact moment the town would desperately need what he had. "Why didn't my dad sell it to them?" Maggie asked, her voice shaking. "Because Roderick's father, Richard, ruined your grandfather," Thomas said quietly. "He drove your family into bankruptcy during the mill closures. Your father didn't want their money, Maggie. He wanted to watch the Pendletons choke on their own greed. He was waiting for Roderick to sign the final contracts with Apex. He was waiting for the trap to spring. Maggie looked at the piece of paper, the one Roderick had laughed at, the one he had mockingly offered $500 for. Roderick Pendleton had already signed the contracts. The town had already begun demolition for the staging area. The tech company was already breaking ground. Roderick had built a $40 million house of cards, completely unaware that a dead man and his estranged daughter held the only deed that could keep it from collapsing. "Does Roderick know?" Maggie asked. "He thinks the county owns the subsurface rights." Thomas smiled, a wicked, jagged grin. "The Pendletons have always been arrogant. They rarely check the basement archives. He just assumed the quarry was dead surface land." Maggie carefully folded the deed and slipped it back into her jacket. The fear, the humiliation, the crushing weight of her own failures, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing fire. "Mr. Abernathy," Maggie said, standing up, "I need a copy of the Apex Dynamics water compliance requirements, and I need the name of the most ruthless corporate litigator in the state." As Maggie walked out of the courthouse and back into the sweltering July heat, she saw a convoy of yellow bulldozers rolling down Main Street, heading toward her father's house. Roderick was making his move, intent on wiping the Sullivan legacy off the map. Maggie watched them pass, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. Let him knock the house down. It didn't matter anymore. The banker had enjoyed his laugh. Now, it was her turn. The skyline of Pittsburgh was a stark contrast to the decaying, slow-paced streets of Oakmont. Maggie sat in the glass-walled conference room of Gallagher, Hayes and Abernathy, no relation to Thomas, but a serendipitous coincidence. Across from her sat Harrison Gallagher, a 60-year-old senior partner who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He was one of the most feared corporate litigators on the Eastern Seaboard, a man who dismantled Fortune 500 conglomerates for sport. Maggie had practically emptied her meager savings just to secure the retainer, but as Gallagher read over the fragile 1,968 deed, the silence in the room told her it was worth every penny. Gallagher slowly removed his reading glasses, placing them on the polished mahogany table. He looked at Maggie, then back at the deed, then back to Maggie. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "Miss Sullivan," Gallagher rumbled, his voice like grinding stones, "do you have any idea what your father possessed?" "Thomas at the archives said it was the water rights," Maggie replied, keeping her posture rigid despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "The subsurface aquifer beneath the Miller Quarry." "It's not just water rights," Gallagher corrected, tapping the faded blue stamp. "This is a federal subterranean sovereignty grant. They stopped issuing these in 1972 because they realized they were giving away the keys to the kingdom. If Roderick Pendleton and Apex Dynamics want to draw a single ounce of water from that aquifer to cool their data centers, they don't just need your permission, they need your signature on a commercial lease agreement, an agreement where you dictate the price per gallon." Gallagher pulled up a digital map on the conference room monitor, overlaying the Apex Dynamics construction plans with the boundaries of the aquifer. "Roderick Pendleton is currently over-leveraged," Gallagher explained, pointing to the red zones on the map. "He borrowed $40 million against his own family's holdings to purchase the surface land and bribe the local zoning boards to reclassify it for commercial use. He expects Apex to pay him $80 million upon final certification of the site. But Apex's legal team will not release those funds until the environmental and utility infrastructures are completely secured. Which means," Maggie said, her eyes widening, "if Roderick can't deliver the water, he defaults on his $40 million loans," Gallagher finished, leaning back in his leather chair. "He loses his bank. He loses his properties. He is utterly, unequivocally ruined." Maggie felt a cold chill run down her spine. The magnitude of her father's foresight was staggering. Crazy Bill had sat on his sagging porch for decades, enduring the mockery of the entire town, all while holding a loaded gun pointed directly at the Pendleton Empire. He had just been waiting for Roderick to pull the trigger. "So, what's our move?" Maggie asked. "We wait," Gallagher said smoothly. "We let Roderick think he has won. We let him commit entirely." "When is the foreclosure on your father's house scheduled?" Maggie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Tomorrow, Friday morning. The sheriff is serving the eviction, and Roderick is sending his demolition crews." Gallagher looked at her with a mix of sympathy and clinical detachment. "Let them tear it down. Do not interfere. Let him publicly execute the foreclosure. The more confident he is, the harder the fall." The final contract signing between Pendleton and Apex Dynamics is scheduled for next Wednesday at the Oakmont Municipal Building. That is when we strike. Friday morning arrived with a brutal, suffocating humidity. Maggie did not return to Oakmont. She sat in her cheap motel room outside Pittsburgh, staring at her phone. At 9 a.m., the device buzzed. It was a text message from Beatrice Gable, accompanied by a video file. The text read, "Thought you should see this. End of an era. Good riddance." Maggie pressed play. The shaky smartphone footage showed her childhood home. Two massive yellow excavators were positioned on the overgrown lawn. Roderick Pendleton stood on the sidewalk, wearing a crisp white polo shirt and aviator sunglasses, chatting amiably with Mayor Collins. Roderick gave a casual flick of his wrist. The first excavator's claw smashed into the front porch, shattering the wooden steps where her father used to sit and read his geological surveys. The roof groaned and collapsed in a plume of toxic gray dust. Maggie watched as 20 years of her father's life, his struggles, and his supposed madness were reduced to splintered wood and crushed drywall. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She watched the video on a loop, letting the anger crystallize into something hard and unbreakable. "Make them pay," her father had written. Wednesday morning, the Oakmont Municipal Building was buzzing with an electric, celebratory energy. The town council chambers had been transformed into a corporate boardroom. A catered breakfast buffet lined the back wall, and local reporters were snapping photos of the town's elite rubbing shoulders with Silicon Valley executives. Roderick Pendleton sat at the head of the long oak table, looking like a king holding court. To his right was Mayor Collins, sweating profusely in a tight suit. To his left sat Richard Belmont, the Vice President of Infrastructure for Apex Dynamics, flanked by two sharp-suited corporate attorneys. "Gentlemen, I think we can all agree this is a historic day for Oakmont," Roderick declared, raising a glass of sparkling water. "The Pendleton Tech Park will bring thousands of jobs, revitalize our economy, and establish this county as the premier data hub of the East Coast." Belmont offered a polite, practiced smile. "Apex is thrilled, Roderick. The surface topography is perfect, and the tax incentives the mayor provided are generous. But as my legal counsel has reminded me, we are at the final hurdle. We need the signed and notarized certification for the municipal water tap into the Miller Aquifer. The cooling systems for our server farms are non-negotiable. Without the water guarantee, there is no $80 million wire transfer." Roderick waved his hand dismissively. "A mere formality, Richard. The county owns the subsurface utility rights, and the mayor has already signed the provisional access decree." Roderick slid a thick manila folder across the table toward Belmont's lawyers. "It's all right there. The aquifer is yours to tap." Belmont's lead attorney opened the folder and began scanning the documents. Roderick leaned back, intertwining his fingers behind his head, the picture of absolute victory. He had done it. He had doubled his family's fortune and cemented his legacy. The heavy double doors at the back of the council chambers swung open with a loud, echoing crack. The room fell silent. Reporters lowered their cameras. Roderick's smug smile faltered as he looked down the center aisle. Walking side by side were Maggie Sullivan and Harrison Gallagher. Maggie wore a tailored charcoal blazer and trousers. She looked nothing like the defeated, grieving daughter Roderick had mocked in the bank lobby just a week prior. Gallagher walked with the slow, predatory gait of a man about to feast. "Mayor Collins, Roderick," Maggie said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I hope we aren't interrupting." Roderick stood up, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and fury. "Maggie, what the hell are you doing here? This is a closed corporate meeting. Deputy Higgins, escort Miss Sullivan out of the building." Deputy Higgins took a step forward, but Gallagher raised a single commanding hand. "I wouldn't do that, Deputy, unless you want to add a federal civil rights lawsuit to the catastrophic legal nightmare this town is about to inherit," Gallagher boomed. He walked to the front of the table, ignoring Roderick entirely, and extended his hand to the Apex executive, Harrison Gallagher. "I represent Miss Margaret Sullivan, the sole heir and executor of the William Sullivan estate." Richard Belmont shook his hand, looking confused. "Richard Belmont, Apex Dynamics. What is the meaning of this, Mr. Gallagher?" "It means," Gallagher said, unlatching his sleek leather briefcase, "that Roderick Pendleton is attempting to sell you stolen goods." The council chambers erupted in a chaotic murmur. Mayor Collins went pale, clutching his chest as if he might have a heart attack right there. Roderick slammed his hands on the table. "That is slander," Roderick shouted, his composure shattering. "She has nothing. I foreclosed on her father's estate last week. The Sullivans are bankrupt. This is a pathetic extortion attempt by a crazy man's daughter." Gallagher calmly pulled a thick stack of documents from his briefcase and dropped them directly in front of Belmont's attorneys. At the top of the stack was a high-resolution notarized copy of the 1968 deed, with Addendum C highlighted in bright, unmissable yellow. "Mr. Belmont," Gallagher said, his voice dropping to a conversational yet deadly tone, "my client's father purchased the Miller Quarry 50 years ago. In doing so, he secured a federal subterranean sovereignty grant for the aquifer beneath it. Roderick Pendleton owns the dirt on top. but Miss Sullivan owns every single drop of water underneath. Roderick let out a forced, hysterical laugh. It's a fake, or it's outdated. The county claimed eminent domain over abandoned subterranean utilities in 1994. Eminent domain applies to state and municipal utilities. Roderick, Gallagher corrected, looking at the banker with absolute pity. This is a federal grant. It supersedes county zoning laws. It supersedes state law. And according to the Federal Geological Survey, the Miller Aquifer is completely landlocked beneath my client's property. It is private water. Belmont's lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Jenkins, had been frantically reading the 1968 deed. She looked up, her face completely drained of color. She whispered something into Belmont's ear and slid the document toward him. Belmont's expression darkened instantly. He turned to Roderick, his eyes cold and furious. Roderick, did your legal team verify the title chain on the subsurface rights? Roderick swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. Richard, listen to me. It's a dead quarry. We checked the county surface logs. I didn't ask about the surface logs, Belmont barked, his voice echoing off the walls. We are investing billions into this infrastructure. We specifically demanded absolute clearance on all utility rights. Are you telling me you brokered a $40 million land deal without checking the federal archives for sovereignty clauses? We assumed. Roderick stammered, his arrogant facade crumbling into dust. He looked at Maggie, his eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. He remembered the bank lobby. He remembered laughing at the yellowed piece of paper. I will give you $500 out of my own pocket right now for this piece of trash. Assumptions are for amateurs, Mr. Pendleton, Gallagher interjected. As it stands, Apex Dynamics cannot legally draw water for its facility, which means this entire commercial park is useless. Belmont stood up, aggressively buttoning his suit jacket. This meeting is over. Roderick, you are in breach of our preliminary contract. If this is not resolved in 48 hours, Apex will pull out of Oakmont, and we will sue your holding company for gross negligence and misrepresentation. Wait, Richard, please, Roderick begged, chasing after him. Don't talk to me, Belmont snapped. He turned his attention to Maggie and Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher, Miss Sullivan, Apex still wants this site. We have already sunk millions into the initial grading. What are your terms for the water rights? Maggie stepped forward. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking up at the power players of Oakmont. She was looking down at them. We are not selling the rights, Mr. Belmont, Maggie said clearly. My father held onto that land for 50 years. It stays in the Sullivan family. However, we are willing to negotiate a 99-year commercial lease for industrial water usage. Belmont nodded slowly. And the price of the lease? $25 million up front, Maggie said, her voice unwavering. Plus, a royalty of 2 cents for every 1,000 gallons drawn, adjusted annually for inflation. Mayor Collins gasped. Roderick looked as though he had been physically struck. 25 million? You're insane. Richard, you can't pay that. That eats into the entire capital budget for the land acquisition. The capital budget we were going to pay you, Roderick, Belmont retorted coldly. He looked back at Maggie. 25 million is steep, Miss Sullivan. It severely diminishes the valuation of Mr. Pendleton's surface land. That sounds like Mr. Pendleton's problem, Maggie said, staring directly into Roderick's panicked eyes. My father was a good man. This town treated him like a joke. Mr. Pendleton bulldozed my family home 3 days ago just to prove a point. So, those are the terms. 25 million or Apex Dynamics can go find another town, and Mr. Pendleton can explain to his creditors why he defaulted on $40 million in bridge loans. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Roderick's breathing was ragged. He looked at Mayor Collins for help, but the mayor was aggressively staring at his own shoes, completely abandoning ship. Belmont looked at his attorney, who gave a subtle nod. The water lease would cost them, but they could deduct it from Roderick's final payout. Apex would survive. Roderick would not. We will have our legal team draft the lease agreement this afternoon, Miss Sullivan, Belmont said, extending his hand to Maggie. It's a pleasure doing business with you. Maggie shook his hand firmly. Likewise. As the Apex executives packed their briefcases and marched out of the room, the local reporters scrambled after them, smelling the blood in the water. Bankers. Blunder. Sullivan here holds town hostage. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Roderick was left standing alone at the head of the table. His pristine world had evaporated in less than 10 minutes. Because Apex was reallocating $25 million to Maggie, Roderick's final payout would not even cover the loans he took out to buy the land. He was bankrupt. First Fidelity Bank would be seized by federal regulators. His family's legacy in Oakmont was over. Maggie walked slowly toward him. Roderick looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Maggie, please," Roderick whispered, his voice cracking. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimper of a beaten man. "You don't understand. My father's trust. The bank. I'll lose everything. I'll be ruined." Maggie stopped a few feet from him. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a crisp, new $50 bill, and dropped it on the oak table in front of him. "Tell you what, Roderick," Maggie said, her voice a deadly quiet echo of the bank lobby. "I feel bad for you. I really do. Here's $50 out of my own pocket, just to save you the trouble of using your foreclosure notices as kindling." She turned her back on him and walked out of the chambers, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. 6 months later, Oakmont was unrecognizable. The Apex Dynamics data center was halfway completed, bringing a massive influx of union jobs and infrastructure money to the struggling town. But the real change was in the town's spirit. Roderick Pendleton had quietly packed his bags in the dead of night, fleeing town after his holding company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. His beloved bank was bought out by a regional chain. Maggie did not keep the $25 million for herself. She paid off her father's debts, bought a modest townhouse in Chicago, and used the vast majority of the funds to establish the William Sullivan Foundation for Geological Sciences at the local community college. She also funded the construction of a brand new public library for Oakmont. On the day of the library's ribbon-cutting ceremony, the town gathered in the autumn air. Beatrice Gable was there, looking appropriately chagrined. Mayor Collins, who had miraculously survived the political fallout by pretending he had always supported the Sullivans, gave a rousing speech. But Maggie didn't care about the politicians or the gossips. She stood near the entrance, looking at the large bronze plaque mounted on the brick wall. It didn't mention the bank, or Roderick, or the quarry. It simply read, "In loving memory of William Sullivan, he saw the truth beneath the surface when the rest of the world was only looking at the dirt." Maggie reached out, tracing the raised metal letters with her fingertips. A cool breeze swept through the courtyard, rustling the autumn leaves. For the first time in 16 years, Maggie smiled in Oakmont. The stray had returned, and she had bought the whole damn town. The story of Maggie Sullivan proves that true wealth isn't always in bank accounts sometimes. It's buried in the fine print of history, waiting for the right person to dig it up. Crazy Bill wasn't crazy. He was playing a 50-year game of chess, and Maggie delivered the final checkmate. If this story of ultimate revenge and hidden treasure gave you chills, smash that like button, share this video with someone who loves a plot twist, and subscribe for more incredible real-life dramas.
Hi, my name is Nguyen Doyen, the owner and manager of Coyote Frontier Heights. After watching the video, the banker laughed at the abandoned daughter, then her 1968 deed silenced the whole town. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of quiet vindication. Watching someone who had been overlooked and underestimated discover the value hidden in something everyone else dismissed was incredibly satisfying. It's a reminder that appearances don't always tell the full story, and sometimes the truth is buried in details that others ignore. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which moment stood out to you the most? The discovery of the old deed, or the way Maggie handled herself when everything finally came together? Do you think you would have held on to that document or accepted the quick offer and walked away? One small lesson I took from this story is to be careful about judging people or situations too quickly. Patience, curiosity, and paying attention to the fine print can sometimes reveal opportunities others miss. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you enjoy stories about inheritance, family secrets, and unexpected turns, consider liking the video or subscribing to Coyote Frontier Heights for more stories like this.